Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center and the Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled James Baldwin's America and Ours Today. And I'm joined by Eddie S. Glaude, Jr., Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Today is September the 16th. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center, and on behalf of Jira, Meredith, and Mike Williams, who's with us tonight, I want to thank you for spending yet another 90 minutes with us, discussing contemporary issues and curriculum and finding ways that the humanities really can infuse our work and give us a chance to better understand ourselves. In particular, I want to welcome Herbert. Herbert's joining us tonight from Memphis, and Warren, who is coming across the borders. He's joining us from Toronto tonight. Great to have you with us, Warren. Jenny and Jonathan are on either side of me. Jenny is in Raleigh. Jonathan is in Greensboro here in North Carolina. It's always a pleasure to have them with us. Francis is here from Warner Robins, Georgia. And always we have many folks from Los Angeles Unified tonight. Angelo and Melissa are here as well. Abina, I see that you're in the room. Abina was a fantastic graduate student participant in some of our summer programs. Abina, it's great to have you join us from Nashville and Vanderbilt University. The National Humanities Center was founded in 1978, and since then we've welcomed an annual fellowship class of university-level academics and professors who come to the center for a full, unencumbered year of research and writing. And I think after getting to know at least some, if not many, of the past fellows and the current fellows, I do think that there's one sort of central theme that seems to come across. Now, these are folks who work deeply in history and culture and identity. These are academics and professors who are highly trained in literary studies and philosophy and music and the arts. And I think one of the things that I tend to notice the most when they speak of their work, when we have conversations in the hallway or in our commons, which, by the way, has been renamed just recently and rededicated as the Teachers' Commons, one of the primary themes that emerges is this notion that studying the human experience, particularly that from the past, absolutely can provide guardrails and advice and can channel insights that help us understand the complications of our current moment. You know, this is a complicated world. I don't need to tell any of the teachers in the room tonight. This is a deeply disrupted and complicated world. And each day you try to make sense of not just your curriculum, but the life experience of your students so that you can help them better prepare to be contributing citizens and family members and community members. And I think what our humanists really would argue more than anything else is that by looking at the words of the past, the verse of the past, the lyrics of the past, the documents, by getting to know and bringing close those voices from our past, we can better understand how to move forward. And I think tonight's session and presentation will get to the heart of that. And we very much appreciate your continued work in taking these conversations and translating them to your classroom. I'm hopeful that our OER platform, the Humanities in Class Digital Library, can help you with that, can assist you with that process of translating scholarship and sophisticated conversations to the environment that you're working with younger people. Don't forget to sign up for the Humanities in Class webinar series group in that same library. There you'll find all the resources that we've curated both from the center as well as over 90 other humanities organizations that are free and open for you to use in your classroom. That does include the resources that we've pulled together for tonight's session. Those are resources not only pulled and offered by Professor Glaude, but also by our TA, Tisha Hooks, who spent some time collecting instructional materials that may help you bring James Baldwin to your classroom. And in particular, take a look at this folder in the next couple of days. This is where I'll put a copy of the PowerPoint from tonight's session. This is also where we put recordings of each of our webinars. So you can go back and listen and linger. You can invite your students to participate. And while this is a teacher-facing and educator-facing platform, you are more than welcome to invite your students to get library cards and access the many different scholarly and instructional materials that we have available. The webinar series continues to be really our primary and weekly work to connect scholars and educators in deep conversation. And I suspect that many of you are here tonight because you do have interest in issues of race and identity and social justice. This is episode 5 of a 40-episode season, so we have lots of different topics that we're covering. but these four might appeal to you if tonight's session is something that brought you forward and you felt important enough to come out of your home tonight, or perhaps your classrooms. For example, on November the 4th, I'll be joined by Ayanna Thompson from Arizona State to talk about decolonizing the Shakespeare curriculum. Later in November, I'll be joined by Jody Moore from USC, from University of Southern California, to look pretty closely and deeply at the race riots of Los Angeles in 1992. My first year in the classroom, by the way, and I distinctly remember teaching this as a current event, as something I was trying to help my students make sense of. Later in the series, we'll be joined by past fellow Sandy Darity. He'll be sharing his work on wealth inequality and the concept of Black reparations in the 21st century. It could be that these webinars are just a taste for you and you really enjoy the listening and the interacting through the chat box, but you want to get a little bit more deeply into the topics. If that's the case, I do encourage you to sign up for any one of our online courses. These 5-week courses give you a chance to really spend more time learning and interacting with other educators and scholars to explore these kinds of topics. Our September sessions have already begun, but as Mike Williams will put in the chat box, we are still accepting applications, or registrations, I should say. And of course, we'll have a winter session that will be announced shortly. All of our work is in many ways deeply supported by the Teacher Advisory Council. These 21 educators from grades leveling at the elementary level up to the university level are in a very, very important part of our team. We work with them to make sure that what we offer is relevant and the ways that we're seeking connections can be meaningful for the classroom teacher. And while Mike, Jira, Meredith, and I all have a lot of classroom experience, it's nothing like standing in the classroom right now. And so I'm deeply grateful for them sharing their insights and giving us their contributions. Tonight's webinar is an audio-only webinar. You'll hear our voices, but you won't be able to speak to us unless you start chattering in the chat box. And I do encourage you to use the audience chat to not only interact with each other, share resources and questions, but if you've got a more formal question you'd like to bring forward for Professor Glaude, please do use the Ask the Professor tab. That question then will go directly to me as the moderator, and I'll find time to bring it into our conversation and give him a chance to respond to you very directly. If for any reason the session gets disrupted tonight on your end, the Wi-Fi is not working clearly, your audio is kind of crackly, I hate to say it, I wish it were more sophisticated than this, but the easiest thing to do is to simply log out and come back in. So it will not disrupt our session and it will not disrupt our record of your attendance. So just take a moment to close your window and come back in. So again, you have joined us for the Humanities in Class webinar titled James Baldwin's America and Ours Today. I'm joined by Eddie S. Glaude Jr. He's the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. I'm also very pleased to welcome Tisha Hooks, who is joining us tonight as the teaching assistant. Tisha is at the Hopkins School in New Haven, Connecticut, and she's going to be dropping questions and comments and links and different instructional resources that she's found into the chat box, so you can again begin to do that very important work of translating scholarship to practice. So, Professor Glaude, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Andy, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Tisha, for all the work that you're doing to make this seminar a success. I'm so excited to be here with you. It's been a long day. I started early this morning, right?
Absolutely, and we appreciate you joining us. And if you don't mind, I'd like to begin tonight's session before you start advancing your PowerPoint with just a quick question of my own for you. And I'm going to go back to the first slide to ask this. You may have noticed in the interim break as folks are arriving and getting settled, finding their seats, we always have a question for them to respond and add a soundtrack. That soundtrack, by the way, came from James Baldwin's favorite record collection, and I'm going to put a link in the box shortly about where to find that. But the quote that I asked folks to respond to is, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that is, one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated." I'm curious, Professor, do you remember for yourself, I think we're the same age, I was born in 1968, do you remember for you when that moment was that you started to examine the society in which you were being educated?
It's very difficult to pinpoint, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
I knew something. I grew up in Mississippi on the coast, where the moss dangled from magnolia trees.
Mm.
And I remember in the fourth grade, Miss Davis was singling me out, and I jumped up and said, "You're racist," and ran out of the room. But I also remember in the eighth grade being taught Civil War history and the battles of the ironclads, and the way in which it was taught. I found myself attracted to Stonewall Jackson. Can you imagine?
Right.
So it was very. It wasn't at that moment. I think it was more so around my freshman year that I began to see things a bit differently. It had something to do with my teachers at Moss Point High School, and it wasn't really consolidated until my freshman year at Morehouse College. It has something to do with public education in the state of Mississippi, I think.
Yeah,
that it took so long.
Interesting. A little bit of a lead-in question. Of course, we're working with primarily educators tonight, and this notion of the climate and culture of our classroom, of the ways that educators bring forth how they treat their students, and also the curriculum can be a barrier. Not being allowed to, or not being invited to, or not having the resources to teach inclusive curriculum that students can see themselves in is a big problem. And we appreciate you then bringing forward your knowledge tonight to help us address that issue.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my delight, and I hope we have a great conversation. So shall I start?
I think so. And again, what I'll do is mind the chat box and the questions, and every now and again I might sort of subtly insert myself and ask you to respond to some of them. But we would love to hear your thoughts on the topic.
That would be great. So I'm excited to have the conversation. So I want to begin with the two quotations, and I think the quotations will offer some insight into how I'm approaching our conversation tonight. The first one comes from Toni Morrison, her essay, Memory, Creation, and Fiction. She writes, "If my work is to be functional to the group, to the village, as it were, then it must bear witness and identify that which is useful from the past and that which ought to be discarded. It must make it possible to prepare for the present and live it out. And it must do that not by avoiding problems and contradictions, but by examining them. It should not even attempt to solve social problems, but it certainly should try to clarify them." And the second quotation comes from, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, The Whiteness of the Whale. "But not yet have we solved the incantation of this whiteness and learned why it appeals with such power to the soul. And more strange and far more pretentious, why, as we have seen, it is at once the most meaningful symbol of spiritual things, and yet should be, as it is, the intensifying agent in things the most appalling to mankind." We find ourselves, and there's no reasonable way to deny this, in a moment of profound transition as a country. One might even say, I think, with a high degree of certainty, that the nation is in profound trouble. America is changing, and the substance of that transformation is not clear. At least it isn't clear to me. And who we will be as a nation has yet to come into view. But we see, if we're looking, and I hope that we're all looking, we see the dark forces mobilizing. We see those who, in the face of the shifts, cleave to old illusions, old ideas and illusions. They insist that our way of life must not change. What remains in the midst of this are the shards of what has been shattered, and many of us end up cutting ourselves against the sharp edges of their passions, it seems to me. So what do we see? We know that there are at least 18 states that have enacted 30 laws restricting access to voting. Texas has restricted women's rights to choose, right? All of which is a reaction to a historic turnout in 2020, to the fact that the demographic shifts that some have forecasted have now come into view. Of course, this is against the backdrop of racial discord, of this racial reckoning that we came out of last summer as we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd in real time. And we saw in the context of the pandemic, people from all walks of life, young, old, black, white, brown, right, risk their lives in the midst of the pandemic to protest police violence. Right? For the first time also in American history, the white population in America is in decline, according to the U.S. Census, right? It feels, given this sharp decline, look at that number. Given this sharp decline, it feels like panic and terror have gripped the nation. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a planet screaming. Historic hurricanes and floods, fires and earthquakes. And all of this is happening in a political environment where it seems that there are forces that have been overrun by illiberal elements and others who seem to be too timid to fight for an America that is desperately trying to be born. And we have to brace ourselves, I think, again, for whatever may happen on Saturday at the Justice for J6 rally planned right around the corner. So in many ways, what we've witnessed over these last few months, the insurrection of January 6th, the spate of voting laws aimed to disenfranchise Americans, the violent assault against Asian Americans, the intensification of the culture wars. As I said, in some ways, it has been a panic about the changing nature of the country. There are those who cling to the idea that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe, that some among us, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more, that these people have, in some ways, a different sense of possession of the country, a different, shall we say, quality of citizenship, while the rest should just simply shut up and be grateful. Of course, the irony here is that this is as old as the Republic itself, this idea. In some ways, this idea is the serpent that has threatened to swallow our fragile experiment in democracy whole every generation. And any serious or sincere grappling with who we will become as a nation, in my view, must confront this serpent in the garden. And in many ways, racism and greed sit at the heart of it all. So I want to begin here because this is America today, right? We're in a moment of transition, demographic shifts, hyperpartisanship. It seems as if we are at each other's throats, right? It seems that a particular political ideology has collapsed and we're trying to figure out how we're going to be together differently. And the irony, of course, is that history haunts, to invoke Faulkner's Requiem for None, right? The past is not past, the past is not dead. The past is not even past, he says, right? And you can see it even in January 6th, right? January 7th on the floor of the Congress when Senator Ted Cruz invoked the Compromise of 1877 as a way to resolve the crisis around the certification of the presidential election. He invoked, yes, he did, the Compromise of 1877. And it's in this context that I reach for James Baldwin. Baldwin, of course, is one of America's most insightful critics of American democracy. He understood the cost, I think, of our national adolescence. Born in Harlem in August of 1924 under the shadow of the Great Depression, and of course, in light of the suffocating effects of racial oppression, Baldwin willed himself into becoming one of America's most powerful writers. He had to leave the country, of course, to do so. In 1948, he said he had to leave the country because either he was going to kill someone or someone was going to kill him. He realized that the hatred that overwhelmed his stepfather was actually overwhelming him. It was taking root in his spirit. He was beginning to see the world through the eyes of those who despised him. Baldwin wrote fiction and nonfiction, plays and poems. He helped pioneer a form of journalism that blurred memoir with reportage. And to my mind, and I say this only to situate him within the American tradition of letters, he is the inheritor of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Walt Whitman provided one answer to Emerson's call, Baldwin another from the other side of the tracks. Now, what I want to do this evening in the short time that we have is turn our attention to the later work of Baldwin, to the later work. Now, I do so with full awareness that some are most familiar with his early writings, works like Notes of a Native Son, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, Another Country, or The Fire Next Time. There was once the belief, and the claim has since been revealed, I think, as nonsense, right? Is that Baldwin somehow turned his back on his artistic and aesthetic commitments and achievements in 1963, that his anger overran his aesthetic choices, or he had, in some ways, had been seduced by the politics of the era. One of his biographers even declared that by 1963, Baldwin's voice had broken. Now, obviously, I disagree. In fact, I think that's silly. What we see and what we should see if we're paying attention is, in fact, an artist struggling to make sense of his times. A writer, a poet, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's sense of the word. Baldwin even uses the definition of the poet in No Name in the Street, where he describes, he says, not without warning and not without precedent, but only poets, since they must excavate and recreate history, have ever learned anything from it. So he acts as this poet, desperately trying to bear witness to a country that, and there's no other way to make the point, but to a country that was in fact at the time turning its back on the promise of the Black freedom struggle. Now, part of what I'm trying to do here is to say, in order to understand what we've experienced this January 6th, and even prior to, some people will say, since 2008 and the election of Barack Obama, we have seen every single year an uptick in hate crimes, where in some ways the election of Barack Obama and this Black family in the White House unleashed all of these dark forces beneath our politics. The ghosts now haunt in public. But we know come 2016, there was an intensification of these tensions and contradictions, and we saw them in full view. But in order to account for this, I think we need to tell a thicker story. We need to understand how history speaks to us. There was, as Baldwin was trying to grapple with this, his own moment, what I call in my book, Begin Again, the after times, there was the moment, there was the promise of the Civil Rights Movement at one point. The protests, the sit-ins, the March on Washington, the brilliance of Dr. Martin Luther King's moral vision, right? The possibilities unleashed by those children, as W.B. Du Bois put it, in the souls of Black folk, those children of disappointment, those made an outcast and a stranger in their own house. It was, in some ways, right, the possibilities unleashed by their demand for full inclusion in American life. We saw the passage of major legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the last major piece of legislation of the Great Society, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. We saw the dismantling of de jure segregation in the South, but Baldwin saw, as early as 1961, in his essay about Dr. King, an essay he wrote in Harper's Magazine, he saw that much more was required of the nation because our troubles went beyond the organization of our social and political lives. Our troubles cut deeper than just simply changing the law, because the trouble was actually in us. In 1964, in an essay he wrote to accompany Richard Avedon's amazing photographs in a book entitled Nothing Personal, Baldwin says, Americans live by lies. We refuse to tell ourselves the truth, right? And that refusal has in some ways deposited itself in every chamber of our hearts, right? There's an evasion at the heart of American life. We don't want to see ourselves for who we actually are. We rather trade in myths and fables, Baldwin suggested. The troubles are in us. They cut to the bone. We are the serpents in the garden. We are. And it was clear that segregation was dying, Baldwin noted, but the real question he asked was, quote, how long and how expensive would the funeral be? Did you hear that? Segregation was dying. I mean, Jim Crow, right, as emerging out of the collapse of Reconstruction, right? I mean, this is a story we have to tell for Ted Cruz to invoke the Compromise of 1877 is to invoke that moment, right, when the door was closed on the attempt to actually build a multiracial democracy, where the lost cause asserted itself, right, where the South began to open another front of the war, as it were. And, a person like Frederick Douglass lived long enough to see not only Abraham Lincoln sign the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but he also lived long enough to see the first Jim Crow laws passed in Mississippi and the state of Tennessee. He would describe these people, he would describe Americans as the Apostles of Forgetfulness. And so what did we see over the course of this period between, right, the collapse of radical Reconstruction, right, and the dawn of the 20th century? Right. We saw another form of slavery, right, with tenant farming and sharecropping and the like. We saw, in many ways, the police deployed in order to discipline the population. Right. We saw the disenfranchisement of Black folk. Right. We saw the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism becoming the justification not only for racial apartheid in the South, but also for America's imperial ambition across the world. C. Van Woodward, in his wonderful book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, writes that the very moment in which the South is consolidating Jim Crow, right, we're annexing the Philippines. We're bringing millions of people of color under U.S. rule. Baldwin says it's clear by 1965. It's clear as he was writing in 1961 about King that segregation was dying, but the question again was how long and how expensive would the funeral be? He ended that Harper's piece. We could talk a little bit more about Reconstruction if we want. But he ended that Harper's piece with an ominous prophetic message. Listen to what he said. He said, the Negro who will emerge out of this present struggle, whoever indeed this dark stranger may prove to be, will not be dependent in any way at all on the many props and crutches which help form our identity now. And neither will the white man. We will need every ounce of moral stamina we can find, he writes. For everything is changing. From our notion of politics to our notion of ourselves, and we are certain as we begin history's strangest metamorphosis, we are certain to undergo the torment of being forced to surrender far more than we ever realized we accepted. It's a fascinating formulation. Right? So this is 1961. Baldwin is already seeing the tensions, the refusal of the nation to change. He has this wonderful line, America is changing all the time and it never changes at all, to paraphrase him. Now, of course, Dr. King would be shot, would be dead 7 years later. And in between, many of the young people who sat in nonviolently, who risked themselves in the bowels of the South to register sharecroppers in Mississippi and Alabama, many of those young people were radicalized. Some, like Stokely Carmichael, who later in life declared that he only broke nonviolent discipline once. And this was, again, the March Against Fear in Mississippi when the police, accosted Dr. King. Carmichael said that when the members of SNCC what the members of SNCC witnessed in the South was raw terror. And what was needed was Black power. He declared that Black people weren't going to jail anymore, and what Black people needed was Black power. So part of what we have to do is kind of re-narrate the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. We often think of the Black freedom struggle as the Civil Rights Movement and then the Black Power Movement as if these aren't connected. And what Baldwin wants to insist is that Black power, right, is intimately connected to the civil rights movement. Many of the proponents of Black Power were actually proponents of nonviolence. Baldwin saw this shift in the disposition of the young activist early on. I write about a meeting at Howard University with young student activists from NAG who were from Howard, who became a critical part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was 1963, and Baldwin saw in their eyes exhaustion. Even in the Harper's piece in 1961, Baldwin insisted that the student sit-ins heralded a shift in the movement, and Dr. King was caught between the conservative forces of an old leadership class constituted under one set of conditions and the radicalism of the student movement. And we saw those conflicts come to a head in Selma. You know, we're constantly always talking about and lifting up the importance of Selma, right, as we lift up John Lewis, which we should. And oftentimes people will forget that John Lewis was a part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was the chair of SNCC. And he comes out of that organizing organization in some ways, right? Grassroots organizing, right? But in Selma, all of these forces collided. We have to complicate Selma. What happened between the first march on March 7th, where John Lewis was so brutally beaten, and the second march on March 9th, when Dr. King told the marchers to turn around, and the SNCC activists chastised him, derided him by calling him the Lord, D-E-L-A-W-D. And what happens by the third march on March 21st? There were debates about the approach of Black struggle, divisions around ideology. Remember, Malcolm X had already spoken in Selma in February 4th of 1965, just 20-something days before his own assassination, and how those divisions would lead SNCC organizers to turn their attention to the locals in Lowndes County, Alabama. Many of those SNCC activists would linger behind and organize the Lowndes County Party, right, that would use the Black Panther as its symbol as they marshaled their own election in order to elect Black leaders and to show what Black power, political power, would look like. Complicated moment, yes? A complicated moment. And you see Lowndes in Selma, Alabama, not in Chicago, not in New York, not in Oakland, California, using the Black Panther as its symbol. The Black Panther Party in Oakland would not be founded until October of 1966. These were the early days of Black power, and Baldwin was trying to make sense of it all. What did it mean for him to see a history compressed? What happened between the energy of Rosa Parks, the energy of the student sit-ins that, spread like wildfires across the country? What happened between that moment and Angela Davis being on the FBI wanted list, Bobby Hutton being shot down? What happened between students who were, shall we say, excited and willing to risk their lives walking down these dusty highways 2 by 2, trying to register these sharecroppers who were now crying Black power and in some instances burning down cities? Malcolm and King were dead. American cities were burning. And Baldwin tried to give an account of it all. These were America's children, and America was trying to throw them away. And he refused. He refused to let that happen. In July of 1968, just a few months after Dr. King's assassination, and against the backdrop of American cities burning, Baldwin gave an interview to Esquire magazine, and he set the tone of the exchange from the very start. He wrote, it was this odd question from the interviewer. He says, how can we get Black people to cool it? And Baldwin answered, it is not for us to cool it. But aren't you the ones who are getting hurt the most? The interviewer asked. And Baldwin says, no, we are only the ones who are dying fastest. The editors did not seem to grasp how the moral burden of America's nightmare rested not on the black people rioting in the streets or screaming black power, but on the white people who held tightly to the belief that they were somehow, because of the color of their skin, better than others. These people, Baldwin argued, and it's so relevant to our current moment, to how we began, these people had to see themselves otherwise. New laws, gestures of sympathy, and acts of racial charity would never suffice to change the course of the country. Something more radical had to be done. Remember, the trouble is in us. It's in our self-understanding. This is why when you teach Baldwin, you almost always must understand and emphasize the moral underpinnings of the argument. Why is it a moral and ethical argument? Because Baldwin wants to say what we're doing has everything to do with who we take ourselves to be. And because of our commitments to racism, because of our refusal to look the ugliness of who we are and what we've done squarely in the face, we have been, our sense of self has been distorted and disfigured and deformed. Something more radical has to be done. A different history has to be told. As he said in that interview, quote, all that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history, which is not your past, but your present. He goes on to say, your history has led you to this moment. He's talking about, he's saying this in the shadows of America's cities burning. But think about your history has led you to this moment that where we're going to see something on Saturday. We don't know what. This moment where we have the critique of critical race theory, whatever that is. This moment where it seems as if the country's everyone's at each other's throats. Your history has led you to this moment, Baldwin says. And you can only begin to change yourself by looking at what you're doing in the name of your history. End quote. Of course, Baldwin witnessed the country turn its back on the demands for freedom and blame the anger of the young for that betrayal. Here in real time, Baldwin sought to disrupt what would become a standard narrative of the Black freedom struggle. When we read the later Baldwin, what he's doing, and I think this is important for you as you teach the Black freedom struggle, is to kind of disrupt this standard narrative, right? That, and it's a narrative of declension. You tell the story of the Black freedom struggle. You begin with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Then, of course, there is the death of Emmett Till, the murder of Emmett Till, and then the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Rosa Parks refused to get out of her seat, and then you turn to the student sit-ins of 1960 and how the sit-in movement radicalized that effort. And then, of course, there's the high moment, the high water mark of 63 with the March on Washington, and then the legislation that is passed, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Then we talk about the power of Selma without complicating it. And then we jump to Dr. King's assassination in 68. When we tell the story of Black power, it is a narrative of decline. Even Barack Obama told the story in this way. This is a moment, right, when Black people became bitter and angry, where we turn to violence, right? Where we became the racist, as it were. Some mystical blackness became the ground for our politics. Now, that's a caricature of that complex moment, and I would urge you to read Yale historian Elizabeth Hinton's important book entitled America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s. Baldwin sought to tell a more complicated story. And No Name in the Street is perhaps, I think, his most extraordinary achievement in this regard. He sought to tell a more complicated story, one that wanted to tell the story of these young people who walked those dusty highways in the South and risked life and limb only to be told to wait. But there's the betrayal. The betrayal is the refusal to live up to the promise of Second Reconstruction. Remember, the middle of the 20th century is often described by historians as the Second Reconstruction, trying to fulfill the broken promises of the first. Because here you have the first Reconstruction trying to genuinely build a multiracial democracy. And what do we get in response? As I said, you get another form of slavery with convict leasing, tenant farmer sharecropping. Right? You get Jim and Jane Crow. You get the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism. And even you get the violence of moments like Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when red shirts literally engaged in a violent coup of local government. It's just one among many, right? As violence was used to overthrow Reconstruction forms of government, right? And hundreds of thousands of Black people were left dead in unmarked graves. Now, the middle of the 20th century is often described as the Second Reconstruction, an attempt to fulfill the broken promises of the first. And what do we get in response? We got calls for law and order. Right? Remember, with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the country's response was to elect Richard Nixon twice. I should say that again. With the assassination of Dr. King, the country's response was to elect Richard Nixon twice. And what we also saw, the tax revolt in California. Where we had the vestiges of a political ideology that would lead to the erosion of the social safety net, which we're trying to address now, where people thought that big government was infringing upon the liberties of folk by transferring money from hardworking white people to undeserving Black and brown people. We see a response by white America, working white America. Here's an image of the Hat Riot on May 8th, 1970, of helmeted white construction workers chanting "All the Way USA" as they ripped through an anti-war demonstration in Manhattan's financial district, literally attacking young people, young white and Black and brown people who were clamoring for a different America. And this happened just 4 days after the death of 4 students at Kent State University. Remember the nation's response, right? The backlash, as some historians like to call it, right? The backlash, I'll come back to this one. This is the anti-busing riot in Boston, right? I'm trying to suggest that this is not just a Southern affair, y'all. The anti-busing riot in Boston, the U.S. flag used to attack a Black man here, right? Right? School buses carrying African American children were assaulted by adults. The country had turned its back, and Baldwin wanted to give an account. And this is no name in the street, it seems to me. This is an extraordinary book. And Andy, you let me know if you want to intervene with some questions or not, because I can go on and on.
We do have questions that are queuing up, and since you have invited me to do so, I am going to ask you to pause for a moment. I'm going to bring a couple of comments and questions to you. This will give you a chance to get some water as well, and then we can return. The first question I'd like for you to address, this comes from Lori. Lori is joining us from Western North Carolina. I wonder if you could talk some about the use and misuse of gratitude as a means of control.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So there's this idea that in moments of progress, that oppressed minorities, if you want to put it that way, or Black people more specifically, should be grateful for the progress itself. And let me get at it in a different way, Andy. Oftentimes, gratitude proceeds from an assumption that racial justice is a philanthropic enterprise. That racial equality is a philanthropic enterprise. That is to say, that it is the possession of some to give to others. And Baldwin loathed this question. What else does the Negro want? He said, if you thought of me as a human being like you think of yourself, you couldn't ask that question. You would know that I would want just exactly what you want. But if Black people are thought of as objects of charity, then the expectation of gratitude in these moments of progress serve to arrest demand, right? Serve to arrest substantive change, because it's not just simply the loud racists that constitute the problem, right? It's those who believe that racial justice, racial equality is a charitable enterprise. I hope that makes sense.
I think it does. Thank you. This question comes from Rashid. Rashid is in the Ministry of Education in Morocco and is got a very clear question. She asks, do you agree with Henry Louis Gates that James Baldwin is the alienated artist rather than the organic intellectual, because he couldn't communicate a clear political message to an audience he wasn't only supposed to dissect, but also to uplift?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think Baldwin understood his role as an artist to bear witness. His task was to bring the power of his pen and his perception to invoke Henry James to write at the pitch of passion in some ways, to bear on the circumstances of men and women in the United States, and particularly Black women and men in the United States. And so he needed the requisite distance to do so, but Baldwin he didn't like describing himself as an exilic intellectual. He wasn't alienated from Black communities. I mean, I think near the end of his life, he was more concerned about how his fame and wealth produced a distance between him and the communities to whom he was dedicated. But if that's the question, that same problem confronts Henry Louis Gates and myself. You know what I mean? So I don't think that's the right description of what he's up to, and I try to make that argument in my book and begin again.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to give Rashid a follow-up question.
Sure.
Can you speak a little bit about the abusive criticism that Eldridge Cleaver addressed to James Baldwin?
Oh yeah, it really hurt him. You know, Eldridge Cleaver had this view. He said that Baldwin was the most self-hating Negro he had ever read. You know, he read Nobody Knows My Name, and on the page, Baldwin is trying to be as honest, ruthlessly honest about himself as possible. And, you know, in some ways, it's an excavation of what Du Bois described in 1903 as double consciousness. What does it mean to see oneself through the eyes of those who despise you? You know, so Baldwin is trying to grapple with what does it mean to understand oneself, right, through the eyes of those who devalue you. So when you read, for example, Nobody Knows My Name, at the beginning of that book, we're trying to find it, right? It's a fascinating moment in the introduction, Andy. You know, I have the book right here in front of me. I have to read it. He says, in America, the color of my skin had stood between myself and me. In Europe, that barrier was down. Nothing is more desirable than to be released from an affliction, but nothing is more frightening than to be delivered, divested of a crutch. It turned out that the question of who I was not solved because I removed myself from the social forces which menaced me. Anyway, these forces had become interior, and I had dragged them across the ocean with me. The question of who I was had at last become a personal question, and the answer was to be found in me. So that what he was trying to do was to kind of think about how white supremacy had shaped his own self-perception, how it had distorted his own sense of self and the like, right? And then there's this sense that we cannot forget that Baldwin is this queer Black man who came out in the 1950s. It's actually mind-blowing. When I interviewed Angela Davis, she said in so many ways he was out there all by himself. I mean, after the second novel, after he published Go Tell It on the Mountain, is Giovanni's Room, a same-sex love story, right? That he says is a love story. You know, it just happens to be a same-sex couple, right? And so he says, you know, you can't hold that over my head. I told you. And so here you have Eldridge Cleaver making the claim that he's a self-hating Negro who simply wants to be invaded by white men, to use that verb, you know? And Baldwin was really devastated by that critique. And when you read the early Black Panther Party papers, when Eldridge Cleaver had to leave to escape the country and he escaped to Algiers, and the Panthers were trying to raise money to sustain him, the first name on the list of donors was James Baldwin. Mm-hmm. But it's really an argument around hypermasculinity and how Baldwin queers Black power just by his very presence.
Right. One last question. This one is
Sure.
more of a clarification, I think, and then we can move on. I'm going to move back to an earlier slide to ask this question. Jenny, who is joining us from North Carolina State University in nearby Raleigh, asks, with the declining white population as represented in this chart, how is white categorized? Would the child of a white parent and a minority parent, for example, Vietnamese American, not be considered white?
Yeah, I don't think so, right? So I mean, in so many ways, America's racial categories still carry with it the burden of the one drop rule. So they're biracial categories, people. So I think these are folks who explicitly identify themselves as white. And
Fantastic.
one of the things we see is that the first time in the history of the country, right, the white population is in decline. So there is a kind of panic that is tethered to demographic shifts that have made themselves manifest in our politics.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to return to the slide we paused on and invite you to move forward. And again, we'll stop shortly and maybe talk again.
Yeah, I'm going to say a few words about Baldwin's No Name in the Street. And the reason why this book is so important to me is that it's the first book that Baldwin publishes after King's assassination in 1968. And after King is murdered in 68, Baldwin collapses. Of course, there's a failed relationship. He never thought that he could be loved. He said, no one would love an ugly boy like me. He never felt that he could be loved. But King's assassination, brought forward the question, who are these people? What are these people? As Toni Morrison put in the mouth of Stampede and Beloved. What are these people that they would kill an apostle of love? And so here you have this line, this quotation from No Name in the Street that is so fascinating. He says, since Martin's death in Memphis and that tremendous day in Atlanta, something has altered in me. Something has gone away. One could scarcely be deluded by Americans anymore. One scarcely dared expect anything from the great, vast Black generality, and yet one was compelled to demand of Americans, and for their sakes, after all, a generosity, a clarity, and nobility which they did not dream of demanding of themselves. Part of the error was irreducible in that the marchers and petitioners were forced to suppose the existence of an entity which, when the chips were down, could not be located. There are no American people yet. 1972, y'all. And then he says this, the mind is a strange and terrible vehicle, moving according to rigorous rules of its own. And my own mind, after I left Atlanta, that's after he left the funeral of Dr. King, began to move backward in time to places, people, and events I thought I had forgotten. Sorrow drove it there. I think sorrow and a certain kind of bewilderment. So part of what I want to say here is that here, 1972, No Name in the Street, Baldwin is trying to make sense of a movement that is in some ways collapsing. He tried to do it in California with, at a fundraiser that Marlon Brando organized for the Poor People's Campaign, and both Baldwin and King were trying to re-narrate the movement to try to keep it from being kind of absorbed into this triumphant American narrative, but to tell the truth about what had happened and what was happening. And Baldwin had already seen the death of Medgar Evers. He'd already witnessed the murder of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He knew what happened to Jimmy Lee Jackson and all of those unsung heroes and heroines who died, right, out from, not in the full light of cameras and the press and whatnot. He had seen the country turn its back, right? He knew what Ronald Reagan was doing in California, right? Remember, and this is really important for us to understand, that Reagan, for many members of the Black Power movement, many members of the Black freedom struggle, Reagan was as notorious as George Wallace. And so for the country to elect him in 1980, I'm getting ahead of myself, I should back up. right, was in effect a slap in the face. But No Name in the Street is this attempt at the level of form and substance to make sense of the recent past. And so the book is organized in such a way that it reflects a kind of traumatic rememory. It folds back on itself. It moves from the past back to the present and then back to the past. Baldwin misremembers, right? He's trying in so many ways to figure out how to pick up the pieces. And in doing so, it requires in some ways a kind of reckoning, an encounter with history as such. And here's a passage that I have to read. He says, what had begun in Montgomery, and he's narrating the history here, and the context, I should give you the context, is that, you know, he landed, and he's recalling a time when he landed in, he's going to interview Dr. King for the Harper's Magazine piece in 1961. And he landed in an airport in Montgomery, and he saw these three white men. Says Baldwin recalled landing at Montgomery's airport and feeling the intense hatred in the eyes of three white men who watched him struggle with his typewriter as he walked to the car of a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association who finally arrived to pick him up. And he's recalling this in No Name in the Street. Right? He's recalling what he described as the poverty of spirit that he saw in the eyes of these three white men who vehemently hated him and did not know who he is, even though they did not know him. And so he tried to tell this history. And here's the passage. What had begun in Montgomery was beginning to happen all over the South. The student sit-in movement has yet to begin. No one has yet heard of James Forman or James Bevel. We have only begun to hear of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X has yet to be taken seriously. No one except their parents has ever heard of Huey Newton or Bobby Seale or Angela Davis. Emmett Till had been dead 2 years. Bobby Hutton and Jonathan Jackson had just mastered their first words, and with someone holding them by the hand or discovering how much fun it is to climb up and down the stairs. Oh, pioneers. Oh, there's a Whitman reference. Oh, pioneers. I got into the car, and we drove into town, the cradle of the Confederacy, the whitest town this side of Casablanca, and one of the most wretched on the face of the earth, and wretched because no one in authority in the town, the state, or the nation had the force or the courage or the love to attempt to correct the manners or redeem the souls of those three desperate men standing before that dismal airport, imagining that they were holding back a flood. So here he's trying to convey the passage of time, right? And he's telling us what has happened. I made a mistake. It wasn't, he wasn't interviewing for the 1961. It was an earlier piece he wrote on King, right? But he's trying to convey the passage of time and give us a sense of the arc of this moment all the way to the moment in 1972. Because at the time of his writing, Angela Davis was already on the FBI's most wanted list. Bobby Hutton and Jonathan Jackson are dead. Malcolm dead. Martin dead. So Baldwin's recollection of the moment, this moment in the past, sets in stark relief what has tragically happened since and what has not changed in the country, you see. So No Name in the Street is this account, this accounting of the past. It is a remembering of the past, but it's drenched, right, in pain, in loss, in suffering, in trauma. So it's fragmented. So the form of the book represents this grappling with a history that haunts, a history that is present. And of course, right, he understood that what was on the horizon, right, was that the country had refused to change. Of course, there would be a few of us who would gain access. His last book was The Evidence of Things Not Seen. And it's a book about the Atlanta child murders in a city too busy to hate, a city that had a black mayor and a black sheriff. And Baldwin is trying to ask the question. He's trying to think through the question. What does it mean for white supremacy to still obtain, but black people hold the reins of power? It echoes that was echoed in that moment as Baltimore erupted after the death of Freddie Gray, and we saw a black president, a black mayor, and a black chief of police. Right? But Baldwin is trying to make sense of the country, of this past, of this ghost, of the serpent. What other image can I come up with that continues to haunt, that continues to threaten? And so No Name in the Street is this attempt to grapple with it. It's a beautiful attempt to grapple with history as a curse, history that we must encounter so that we can imagine ourselves anew. And then he says he understands, right? He sees on the horizon the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Right? The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Reagan's election closed the door on the Black freedom struggle. And by 1980, people didn't want to hear Baldwin's prophecy. This is, the 80s. This is the age of, Cosby. This is the rise of the black middle class and the scourge of the black underclass. Reagan turns his back on the Great Society, seeks to undo the basic framework of the New Deal. And for the last 40 years since his election, we have been living, right, by the precepts of Reaganism. Some people describe it as Reaganism, others describe it as neoliberalism, some will describe it as Thatcherism, depending upon where you are. But in some ways, at the heart of that view is this idea that we aren't really citizens, but really self-interested persons in pursuit of our own aims and ends. Kind of political rationality that I think eviscerates any notion of the public good. And so when you listen to Baldwin at the National Press Conference, right, describing the moment, right, saying that this world is not white, it's not black either, and saying that we now live in a moment where our languages, our vocabularies cannot bear the weight of reality. And our task is to create a new way of seeing, a new way of being. And this is an echo of an older formulation from Jimmy, where he says, I want us to do something unprecedented, to create a self without a need for enemies. But between Reagan and the election of Barack Obama, the forces that threatened to overwhelm that we began with, right, were reactivated. Obama's election, right, evidenced or resulted in, right, a kind of fever madness that overtook the nation, it seems to me. Andy, you want to ask another question before I move on to this last half?
Yeah, I do have a couple of questions that have come in.
Sure.
This question is from Tisha. Tisha's with us tonight as our TA. She's a member of our Teacher Advisory Council. She's in New Haven, Connecticut. She writes, in the introduction to your book, Begin Again, you write that when I read The Fire next time, I could not reconcile rage with the talk of love. After your time immersed with Baldwin, can you say a little bit more about that relationship between rage and love in his work and perhaps in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question, Tisha. Baldwin invokes love. He says, people really talk about love, but they don't dare to live in it, That love is this kind of exacting and demanding emotion. And he's not just talking about, agape. There are different elements, different forms of love. We typically talk about agape, philia, and eros. Baldwin is trying to think about love in very complicated ways, right? There's this moment, let me find it in No Name in the Street, in some of the reading that I gave you, right? Where Baldwin is invoking a notion of love that is all about a kind of vulnerability. He says, my falling in love is in no way the subject of this book, and yet honesty compels me to place it among the details. For I know that my story would be a very different one if love had not forced me to attempt to deal with myself. It began to pry open for me the trap of color, for people do not fall in love according to their color. This may come as news to noble pioneers and eloquent astronauts, to say nothing of most of the representatives of most of the American states. And when lovers quarrel, as indeed they inevitably do, it is not the degree of their pigmentation that they are quarreling about, nor can lovers on any level whatever use color as a weapon. This means that one must accept one's nakedness, and nakedness has no color. This can come as news only to those who have never covered or been covered by another naked human being. So love for Baldwin has everything to do with vulnerability and risks. What does it mean to stand before one's lover with all one's blemishes and faults in front of one? And so that risk means that you become other regarding, that you risk yourself. You are vulnerable in that moment. So love becomes for Baldwin the means, the vehicle for a certain kind of mature way of being in the world, right? Something to aspire towards, something that makes us more expansive, right? More enveloping in some ways as human beings. But rage, right, also plays a significant role. All too often we are too adjusted to injustice. And so Baldwin's rage, as I write in the book, lights the kiln. When you read The Fire next time, the sentences burn. He doesn't bite his tongue. When he writes about the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad witnessing a lynching, so the story is told, that gives him a sense of, a kind of relentlessness in his pursuit, right, of a certain kind of dream and vision. He said, for those who have experienced a certain kind of brutality, any language that pretends to clarify it becomes attractive. Baldwin doesn't bite his tongue. Or when he writes about the Black Panther Party and No Name in the Street, he doesn't see these people as irrational, right? He tries to give light to what they're doing. So rage lights the kiln. This is why you cannot run past the late Baldwin. People want to hold off the late Baldwin because they think the anger is too hot. And that says more about the reader than it does about Jimmy, it seems to me. But you got to understand the rage if you're going to understand the power of his invocation of love. They go hand in hand.
Let me ask one last question before
Sure.
we move on. Unfortunately, as the timekeeper, I also can remind us we have about 20 minutes left. So this question comes from Warren. Warren is at the University of York in Toronto, and this is a little bit connected, I think, to the last question. Warren writes and asks, in the 1960s, Hannah Arendt wrote to Baldwin, warning him that in politics, love will achieve nothing except hypocrisy. Can you comment a little bit on Arendt's criticism? And in your view, what does Baldwin's commitment to that same love you just spoke of mean today in the context of domestic, geopolitical, environmental, racial kinds of issues?
Right. I mean, we could have another seminar on Arendt and race, right? Her response to Little Rock, her response to Baldwin, her response to King. It's very complicated, it seems to me. I think I want to insist on something I said earlier, that we have to understand the moral underpinnings of Baldwin's witness, that his interjection in politics it is shaped by his attempt to create the space for the emergence of a different kind of subject. Right? Love becomes he invokes love not to move the levers of politics as Arendt might understand it, or as we might understand it, right? But to kind of set the table for a different kind of imagining of who we take ourselves to be. Right? And this is why I want to insist that he's Emersonian in a sense, right? Or he brings Emerson across the tracks. That Emerson's perfectionism takes on a different kind of resonance, or has a different kind of resonance in Baldwin's hands, and that has political implications, at least in my view, that may not meet Arendt's particular understanding of what politics entail, but it certainly speaks to my own. Right? What does it mean for Black people to imagine themselves in particular sorts of ways that disrupt, right, how they are figured by the body politic. Baldwin says when Black people, how he has this wonderful formulation, Andy. He says when we step outside of the orbit of America's expectations, we're talking revolution. So when Black people step outside of the orbit of white people's expectations, we're talking revolution. And so love talk has this kind of political resonance in that sense. But we could have a whole seminar on rent and race and the Black civil rights movement, it seems to me, and the civil rights movement, it seems to me.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and finish your final thoughts, and then we'll have room for a few more questions at the very end.
Yeah, I see I see some great ones too about the function of expatriation and Ralph Ellison and Baldwin and Hemingway and all. So yes, let me hurry up and be quiet so we can deal with some of these questions. I think part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that, you know, we began with January 6th, and in some ways January 6th and all the things surrounding it is the latest effort to undo what was set in motion by the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. It is the latest, almost the kind of culmination of that backlash, right? An insurrection demanding that that America must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. They're going to take back their country. They're going to stop the steal, as it were. When Barack Obama is elected, right, it signals that the demographic shifts aren't in the distant future, that they've made themselves known in our politics. And immediately it sparks a backlash. And we saw it with the Tea Party. And I remember being a pundit at the time. I wasn't quite as noted as I am now, or visible as I am now. But people thought this was just simply economic populism. But many of us were screaming at the top of our lungs that underneath the Tea Party was this horrific nativism, was this deep and problematic white supremacist strand that we needed to be very, very careful and be alarmed by. And of course, as the Obama years went on, as the 8 years of his presidency continued, it intensified. And then, of course, we ended up with Donald Trump. And of course, that moment, Trump, who in some ways jumped ahead of the Tea Party, became the object of its concern, used the grievance of alienated white Americans. And we could talk about the substance of that alienation and how it is being exploited for very cynical ends, but how that alienation is real and must be taken seriously in some ways. Trump exacerbates the Trumpism, exacerbates the divisions, so much so that we get the horror of Charlottesville, Heather Heyer's death, shouts of Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, right? A kind of mainstreaming of a white supremacist discourse, right? But in order to respond to this, right, we draw back on the past. We go back to those past traditions of protest. Look at this moment, you see. Our power and our fear of change help blind these people to their misery and bewilderment. And insofar as they find this state intolerable, in this state intolerance, we are intolerably menaced. Quoting Baldwin, Baldwin was everywhere, from Ferguson to Baltimore, right? Across the country, people were reaching for Jimmy's language, trying to find a way to think about race and democracy in a way that opened up new possibility. We see the Poor People's Campaign, an echo of King's mission and ministry in the last years of his life. We have to get in the streets. We have to begin to push for a different America. Baldwin would put it this way at the end of No Name in the Street, that in some ways, and I'm paraphrasing here, we have to become better midwives. A new America is trying to be born. And I've put it this way as I've spoken around the country, that every time we have an opportunity for a new America to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of it. So we're experiencing in real time a reassertion of old ideas, people cleaving to their illusions in order to hold back dramatic change. So we see, if you read this, is How to Identify Critical Race Theory in the Classroom. Please take a look at that. It's actually hilarious. But at the same time, we see everyday ordinary people standing in long lines to vote to transform the country. We saw in Richmond, Virginia, the dismantling of the statue of Robert E. Lee. There is possibility. And as Baldwin put it, wherever there's miracle, wherever there human beings are at once disasters and miracles, Baldwin put it. He said, we're at once disasters and miracles. We have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we've become. But, if we show up, there's a chance for a miracle. But in order for there to be fundamental transformation in this country, Andy, we're going to have to tell the truth about who we are. And that's going to require a reckoning with our past, a different and more nuanced account of the civil rights movement, a reckoning with the pain and trauma that comes with a country committed to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. And it's going to have to understand the moral thrust of the argument. And that moral thrust rests in what kinds of people do we aspire to be? What kind of nation do we aspire to be? And at its root, that's a moral question. So let's go to some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We appreciate your thoughts. We appreciate the eloquence in which you've shared them. And as you may have seen out of the corner of your eye, the audience chat was riffing and lots of different comments about what you shared. We have about 10 to 12 minutes, so I'm going to start with a couple of questions that are a little bit more specific and bore down a little bit more tightly on James Baldwin in his context. You mentioned one of them actually as you were reviewing the questions. Talk to us a little bit about why Ellison and Baldwin both claimed Ernest Hemingway as a major influence, and what kind of implications that might have for African American studies.
Well, both of them are American writers, and the old man, offered resources to help Ellison and Baldwin imagine themselves as writers. I think they both have very conflicted relationships with Hemingway. Ellison is critical of Hemingway, even though he recognizes his influence. I think Baldwin is more. I think it's better to look to Henry James as more of an influence on Baldwin. And I've been trying to. I wish I had access to Baldwin's library, because I'm also finding elements of Proust in Baldwin. And I've written a piece in James Baldwin's review to show the relationship between Baldwin and Whitman. And there is clear evidence that Baldwin was reading Whitman closely while he was at the McDowell Colony. So Hemingway is important, but I don't think he's central. They have to deal with him because they're trying to figure out how to be a certain kind of writer. There's a wonderful essay that Baldwin wrote entitled "As Much Truth as One Can Bear," and there he's explicit in terms of how he engages to the American tradition of letters. He's a bit irreverent, but we get a sense of how he orients himself to them. And he's a relatively young writer when he writes that piece.
Fantastic, thank you. This question comes from Greg. Greg is interested in your thoughts on limiting hate speech and hate organizations in the context of Baldwin, in the context of our contemporary concerns and issues. What do you think about limiting hate speech?
We have to be careful. Because oftentimes when we engage in those kind of efforts, it ends up backfiring, and the limits on so-called hate speech become ways to punish those of us who are engaged in progressive politics. So we have to be very, very careful. One of the insidious features of our contemporary political landscape is that those who hold illiberal commitments often use our liberal commitments as the means to undermine them. I should say that a little bit more directly. Right? People are using the very things we value as a way to undermine our very way of life. So we have to walk a fine line so that we don't give up the very things that make us unique as Americans. And I put that in inverted commas, as we try to fight the forces that are trying to destroy our democracy in real time.
Francis has a question that I think I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, Francis. I hope that's okay with you. I'm going to tie it into your answer. You're a pundit, you're a commentator, you've got a voice that is noted and clear and loud. Do you feel like your work as a commentator, as an historian who can comment on the context of these events, do you feel like the media outlets, the personalities, the system that you are a part of, are they listening? Are you getting through? Are you able, you and others, many of whom have been guests on this webinar program, have you been able to influence the ways that those same devices have been used?
You know, some days I feel like I am. Other days I feel like I'm not. You know, there's a moment that went viral, right? You know, and I said, "This is us," and you know, it in that formulation from that moment on the Nicole Wallace show on the Deadline White House, I had literally just written something akin to what I said for Begin Again, and you know, that became a kind of viral moment that allowed us to frame some things. You know, I did a commentary on the racial reckoning, and that language entered into the mainstream in a very interesting sort of way. My task, I think, is to bring the full weight of my bibliography on the subject, and to try to do so within the compressed frame of a soundbite. And some days that drives me to my liquor cabinet.
Fair point. And while the scale might be slightly different, I suspect that many of our educators who are standing with students of all ages might have their hand on the still as well. Here's a question from Jonathan, and what I'm attempting to do, I think, is sort of fine-tune the question so we conclude with the big final question that I know is on everybody's mind. You likely get asked it a lot. So we're going to narrow this down a little bit further. Jonathan asks and notes that you and Baldwin both call for our white peers, our white community, to wrestle with a moral reckoning. But what's going to cause them to honestly do this if time after time they've avoided doing so?
Well, I think, you know, the very possibility that the whole thing will collapse. I mean, today it feels as if the country is broken. And I don't, you know, American optimism is unbounded in some ways, but you know, it just feels like, you know, if we don't make the right choices this time, I don't know if we're going to be able to bounce back. And that's not hyperbole. I don't know if democracy can be salvaged if we don't hold off these forces that once and for all threaten to overrun everything. So I think it's going to be out of self-interest. I also think it's going to come from this younger generation, the generation of catastrophes. I mean, these younger folk, it's not a guarantee because many of them are reaching for neo-fascist languages as well. But these young folk have come of age in just cascading crises, you know? And they're reaching for a different way of being together. So I think it's a combination of the urgency of the moment and not necessarily the Joshua generation, but the generation after that may offer us a path forward.
You know, on a personal note, I can say that my own daughter, my oldest child, is 21, and I realized recently that she was born and during the course of her life has known nothing but the sequence of 9/11, recession of the late 2000s, the current catastrophes. I mean, these things you're exactly right. The cascading anxieties and tragedies, and this generation is going to be, all the students that these teachers are working with right now are going to be a big part of the solution.
And remember, Andy, just really quickly, Andy, also mass murders, mass shootings, all these things. But also, we need to be very, very clear that for the first time, not only do we see the decline in white power, but for the first time in recent memory, Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Zers and Gen Ys or whatever, but Gen Xers and millennials outnumbered baby boomers this past election.
Yeah.
So the shift is happening in our politics as well. So the path is going to be an interesting one. I'll shut up.
Here's the last question. I'm going to give it to my friend Ali. Ali is an educator at the Bank Street School in New York City. And Ali asks, given, and this is a very personal question for you, and you can't talk about your liquor cabinet, given all the crises that we face in contemporary America, Professor, where do you turn for a sense of hope, for that fierce love that Baldwin wrote so powerfully about?
Well, I tried to gesture at it at the end. It's an abiding faith in us, in the capacity of human beings to do the miraculous. But I also think about the tradition out of which I come. And I'll use this as a quick example. In the context of slavery, Andy, there was nothing about the condition of slavery that would lead the enslaved to believe that she would ever live a life other than that of a slave. Nothing. But then there would be the moment where a man in front of her, or a woman, and you can see a glimmer of love in their eyes. Even amid the pain in their face, you can see love. Or you can hear, right, the sound of innocence of children who will more than likely experience a level of brutality that was unimaginable for children. But it's in that moment, that glimmer of love, that sound of innocence, that possibility, right, came into view. And then you were able to look beyond the darkness of the hour to imagine yourself otherwise. If they could survive and keep fighting and keep dreaming, I can have faith in us to do the same.
Professor Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for spending this evening with us. We appreciate your thoughts and insights. Thank you for taking some time from your busy schedule to share this with us.
I hope it was useful. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
I want to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us, and I want to encourage you to follow the National Humanities Center and our social media and email lists to see upcoming events and opportunities. While most things are set, we like to add things pretty often, so please do keep in touch and make sure that anything that's available and interesting to you that you share with your colleagues, both in your school and around the country. I hope to see you at a future webinar. In fact, our next webinar is scheduled for September 21st. I'll be joined by Caroline Janney from the University of Virginia. The topic will be the mythology of the lost cause. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day at school tomorrow, whether you're in person, in hybrid, or online. I hope to see you next time in the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night.